O God, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Good morning, members. Minister's statement. Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, the infrastructure that supports transportation has been critical to Northerners to enable us to grow and develop our economy and to help create opportunities for our residents to find success. Transportation infrastructure has always been at the forefront of enabling Northerners to grow and develop our economy, and never has it been more important in guaranteeing our future growth and prosperity than today. The opening of the all-weather highway between the town of Inuvik and the hamlet of Tuktoyaktuk on November 15, 2017 is an example of what collaboration between all levels of government can do to have our voices heard in Ottawa. Expanding our transportation system with the opening of the Inuvik to Tuk Highway number 10 helps us connect residents to new social and employment opportunities, stabilize the cost of living in the territory, increase our resiliency, and adapt to the impacts of climate change, and provide better access to natural resources. The role our partners play in helping to shape the Northwest Territories today and into the future cannot be overstated. The Inuvik to Tuktoyaktuk Highway number 10 reflects the dedication of many people who have worked to improve the lives of our residents and contribute to building a strong and prosperous Northwest Territories for generations to come. Mr. Speaker, Canada's first highway to the Arctic Ocean is bringing significant benefits to the people of the Beaufort Delta region and global attention to the Northwest Territories. The official opening was a success. It included the attendance and participation of the Governor-General of Canada, Her Excellency the Right Honourable Julie Payette, the Federal Minister of Infrastructure and Communities, Amarajit Sohi, and the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, Ms. Carolyn Bennett, and the Member of Parliament for the Northwest Territories, Mr. Michael McLeod. Our Premier and a number of ministers and members of the Legislative Assembly and other territorial, Indigenous government and community representatives also attended. Mr. Speaker, this new highway is connecting residents and the communities with each other, as well as new opportunities. In its first few months of operation, we are seeing traffic volumes in line with what we had expected. The Inuvik to Tuktoyaktuk Highway number 10 is providing more opportunities for families and friends to connect and share experiences together. The highway has been instrumental in the creation of new relationships and participation prospects such as youth and adult sporting tournaments, hockey, badminton, volleyball, to name a few. It allows families to take advantage of activities at the swimming complex and other facilities that all which contribute to healthy lifestyles. The Inuvik to Tuktoyaktuk Highway number 10 provides opportunities for increased consumers' choice by providing improved road access to other communities. Increased choice in goods and services should be translated into an improved cost of living, better access to health care, and other important benefits. Mr. Speaker, investments in northern transportation infrastructure help diversify economic and social opportunities for people of the North. Working with industry, tourism, and investment, the Department of Infrastructure is committed to helping businesses in the Beaufort Delta region capitalize on economic opportunities created by this project. In recent months, the number one tourism inquiry from potential visitors to the Northwest Territories relates to traveling to the Inuvik to Tuktoyaktuk Highway number 10. The Film Commission has seen an increase in requests to film along this unique northern highway, connecting Canada from coast to coast to coast. The potential impact will be a positive for the people of the Beaufort Delta, with film crews using local services and hiring local skilled crew members. The Beaufort Delta is rich with oil and gas reserves, and a new highway will provide more cost-feasible opportunities for potential development in the region. The Inuit Regional Corp is currently studying the feasibility of natural gas development in the region, and should natural gas extraction be viable, the development of these resources could provide clean energy security, employment opportunities, and support a sustainable economic future in the Beaufort Delta region. Mr. Speaker, there are also important scientific contributions relating to the Inuvik Tuktoyaktuk Highway number 10. The Northwest Territories is a leader nationally and internationally in an area of permafrost study and in contributing to the discovery knowledge of focusing on climate change. The N.W.T Highway number 10 will increase our resiliency in adapting to the impacts of climate change and provide better access to natural resources. The continued expansion of our transportation system will help us to connect residents to new employment, social and cultural opportunities, help stabilize the cost of living for all those who live and work in the Northwest Territories. Nation building and infrastructure projects can happen today in Canada's north, much as they did in previous generations. The partnerships that we continue to build will help the Northwest Territories move forward to become a far greater partner in the Canadian economy and give our residents the opportunity to achieve economic self-determination. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister statement. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Mr. Speaker, we have an ambitious post-secondary agenda that is part of the mandate of this government. Undertaking the foundational review of the Aurora College, working with the college on a renewed long-term strategic plan, and creating a legislative framework to recognize post-secondary institutions will allow us to expand opportunities for post-secondary education for the Northwest Territories residents. The Aurora College Foundational Review is on schedule and will be delivered to me by March 31st. Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank all members of this House for their consideration and contributions to the review process. I look forward to sharing the results of the review and the management response with members when I receive it from the contractor, MNP LLP. A management response will then be prepared to support implementation of the recommendations. Together, the review and management response, along with the Labour Market Information Report, will help establish a strong foundation for the college's long-term strategic plan. The review process has included engagement with staff, students, former students, board members, professional associations, non-government organizations, other post-secondary institutions and partners, and business and industry. There was also an online survey open to the general public. To date, there have been approximately 400 interviews and responses. The results of the review will also help us develop proposed legislation to create an overarching framework to govern post-secondary education in the Northwest Territories. This work is a critical step toward increasing post-secondary opportunities for Northwest Territories residents. We recognize the unique cultural, social, economic, and geographic contexts which define post-secondary learning needs in the Northwest Territories. We are working to ensure that the new legislative framework will benefit all residents and institutions of the Northwest Territories now and into the future. Mr. Speaker, Aurora College is an institution that has grown, changed, and served the Northwest Territories well for more than 40 years. Our college will continue to evolve to meet the needs of 21st century Northern learners in an ever-changing world. We all want to support Aurora College as a thriving Northern post-secondary institution. We all want residents to be able to choose their educational journeys, acquire skills and knowledge, and contribute to the economic and social fabric of the Northwest Territories. I believe the work we now have underway will achieve these goals. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Toonaday-Willowday, that Minister's Statement 19-18(3), delivered by the Honourable Alfred Moses regarding the Aurora College Foundational Review progress, be moved into Committee of the Whole for further consideration. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Motion is in order. All those in favour? All those opposed? Motion carried. Aurora College Foundation Review progress is now moved into Committee of the Whole for further consideration. Merci. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statements. Member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we MLAs from Hay River have a tradition that started 3 assemblies ago, and I'm truly honored to be a part of it. I speak, of course, of the tradition of standing up in this House every 4 years and congratulating Hay River's own Brendan Green for making the Canadian Olympic biathlon team. This is the third consecutive time that Mr. Green will represent Team Canada at the Winter Olympics, which opened this morning in Pyeongchang, South Korea. Mr. Speaker, this is a monumental achievement and cements Mr. Green's legacy as one of Canada's greatest biathletes of all time. After strapping on the skis for the first time at 3 years old, he began training in biathlon at age 9. At 16, he set his sights on the Olympics. And after years of unwavering dedication and training, he made his Olympic debut at 2010 in Vancouver. He was again selected for the 2014 Olympics, and he achieved Canada's best ever result in one of his events and was the fastest Canadian in numerous others. He helped make Canadian biathlon history in 2016 when he anchored his relay team to bronze for Canada's first ever relay medal at the World Championships. He's brought tremendous pride to Hay River and is part of the group of biathletes that have raised the caliber of the sport across the country and raised Canada's profile on the world stage for biathlon. He brings pride to our entire nation. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Green should truly be looked upon as a role model, not for his achievements, but for how he achieved them. I recently read a quote from him about the secret to his success. He said, "There are no secrets. It's about getting the work done, putting your head down, and grinding it out." Mr. Speaker, truer words have never been spoken, and Mr. Green is living proof. Mr. Speaker, would the House please join me in congratulating and cheering on the pride of Hay River, Mr. Brendan Green. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Best of luck to all Northern athletes at the Olympics. Merci Cho. Member statement. Member Ike Goodan and the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Our Legislative Assembly e-petition has been started asking that some of the funds raised through the Western Canada Lottery Program, which now go entirely to sports and recreation, be used to fund activities, arts activities. This issue was also raised during the recent public hearing on Bill 1, the Western Canada Lottery Act. At that hearing, the MACA minister left open the door a crack to develop a definition for recreation, but only in consultation with the sports and recreation groups. So how can we go about improving our government's investment in the arts? Later today, I will table recent correspondence from members of the arts community and the ECE and ITI ministers. ECE says it is responsible for skills development, arts creation, and presentation, and ITI looks after business support to the arts, including marketing and promotion. ECE reports it provides about $2 million annually to support arts and heritage organizations and individuals. The funding is split with 5 grants and funding programs and $600,000 in project grants being supplied through the N.W.T. Arts Council. ITI states it supports arts initiatives to the tune of $1.6 million in 2016-17 through a number of programs. The N.W.T. Arts Council is completely underfunded to meet the administrative load of its oversubscribed programs and has not had an increase in its G&WT contribution in 10 years. Other arts programs are still being administered separately. I recommend that the ministers of ECE and ITI examine structural changes to merge all film, craft and arts programs under the N.W.T. Arts Council so there is a one-stop shop approach that also has adequate capacity. This office would manage both the operating and granting budgets and bring a coordinated, mutually supporting focus to bear on activities from across artistic sectors. It should be the vantage point for accessing other funds, including those from foundations, but most importantly, the many and generous federal funding programs that are out there. I have questions for the Minister of ECE on how we can bring the greatest efficiencies and focus to bear on using and leveraging the funds and increasing our investment in this growth sector of our economy that also creates significant well-being and preserves culture. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Goodan and the member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, recently I heard in the news that the Government of Canada was wrapping up their public consultation in its review of the country's criminal justice system. During the review in the N.W.T, some were saying that the territorial system incarcerates people with addictions, disability, and poor mental health, where it should be offering them treatment. Mr. Speaker, the news article spoke about how the review is focusing on issues such as delays in the court system, better support for victims of crime, and decreasing the number of marginalized and vulnerable people in jail. According to the article, decreasing the number of marginalized and vulnerable people in the jail needs to be the focus of us in the N.W.T. It is my understanding that people come from a trauma situation that sometimes leads to their addictions so they can cope with the difficult issues in their life. Trauma could be from loss, grief, or effects of the residential school systems as some examples. During the trip to visit the treatment centres, we had the opportunity to visit Guthrie House, part of the BC Corrections, which provides residents with a unique program that helps them deal with their trauma and addictions. We had the opportunity to speak with the residents, and they talked openly about their lives, trauma, and their addictions. What I found very interesting was their opening conversation piece when the new inmate comes in. What happened to you? Not what did you do wrong? Powerful words, I would have to say. Mr. Speaker, most people end up in conflict with the law as a result of trauma, addiction, or mental health issues. Our system focuses on punishing people for misconduct and not treating problems like addiction and trauma. I'd like to see residents to be sent to treatment facilities, but sometimes the person ends up in jail. With this in mind, why can't we use the Guthrie model up north to help them deal with their trauma and addictions while they are in there? It is really interesting to hear the residents talk about how they want to heal themselves, and this model helps. It is about providing the necessary tools, peer support, therapy from psychologists, additional counseling, and anger management classes, to name a few. Presently, our approach does not seem to be working. We need to do something differently. I think the model would be a great start. Mr. Speaker, I'll have questions from the Minister of Justice later on today. Thank you.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ika-Goodban and the member YELLOWKNIFE Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I talked about dealing with addictions. Today I want to talk about prevention. Here in the N.W.T, we know the harm alcohol does to residents and communities, but you may be surprised to hear that more people were hospitalized in Canada in 2015-16 for alcohol, the harmful effects of alcohol, than for heart attacks. This is one of the findings of a report on alcohol harm in Canada published last summer by the Canadian Institute for Health Information. The report concludes that provinces and territories with higher alcohol sales also have a higher prevalence of heavy drinking. The N.W.T is part of this trend. The definition of heavy drinking is downing 5 or more drinks in one sitting at least once a month. Heavy drinking costs residents their health, even their lives, and is costing the government hundreds of thousands of dollars in hospitalization costs. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, my grandmother used to say, and prevention in this case involves some straightforward changes. One is to reduce the open hours of liquor stores. The report shows that when liquor stores are open more than 10 hours a day, there are notable increases in both impaired driving and alcohol-related hospitalization. A second way to reduce alcohol harm is to increase the retail price. The report says that a 10% increase in cost results in a 4.4% decrease in consumption. In the N.W.T, we could choose to index alcohol costs to inflation and adjust costs for alcohol content. The aim of both of these measures is to reduce consumption. We must also follow most provinces by setting a minimum price for alcohol. A third possibility is to have clinicians screen patients to spot harmful drinking patterns. The screening is followed by a brief counseling session aimed at reducing consumption and referral to additional care if necessary. Where this approach has been tried, it reduces hospitalization costs with an estimated $4 return on every $1 invested. The Canadian Institute for Health Information has developed a new indicator that tracks hospitalization entirely caused by alcohol. It can provide data for evidence-based decision-making of allocating resources in the short term and monitoring the effectiveness of prevention and treatment programs over the long term. The key is to connect policies around alcohol sales with a harm reduction approach. I will have questions for the Minister of Health and Social Services. Masi.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ika-Goodban and the member Dehcho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. I rise again today to express my respect and appreciation for the dedicated people who keep community fire departments operating in the Metro region. These people undertake training, volunteering their time, and risk their lives to keep their fellow citizens safe from harm. They are on call to work at any time of the day or night, and often in the harshest winter weather conditions. In addition to fighting fires, volunteer firefighters in the district communities such as Enterprise and Fort Providence also serve as first responders to emergencies on the highway. As if it weren't enough today, I want to pay tribute to the community of Enterprise for another notable achievement. On January 10th, the hamlet was recognized by the Department of Environment and Natural Resources as the first community in the Northwest Territories to achieve official Fire Smart recognition. Mr. Speaker, the momentum that led to this milestone started in the spring of 2017 when Enterprise won $500 from the Fire Smart Canada for a Wildfire Community Preparedness Day event. This event prompted the enthusiasm of the community and leaders and volunteers and resulted in the establishment of the local Fire Smart Committee. The committee conducted a wildfire hazard assessment and created a Fire Smart plan for Enterprise. The local volunteers went to work, participating in the community-wide cleanup of potential volatile fire hazards from the community's boundaries. Mr. Speaker, the summer of 2014 was the worst wildfire season in the N.W.T. in 30 years. It reminded us that wildfires pose a serious threat to our communities. I want to acknowledge and congratulate those individuals in Enterprise who took the initiative to make their community a safer place to live, including, my apologies if I mispronounce the names, the Fire Smart Committee, Tammy Neal, SAO, Blair Porter, Fire Chief, Brandon Kimball, volunteer firefighter, Fire Smart community this summer, Brandon Kimball, Michael Kimball, Nicholas Kimball, Glenn Ekohina, and Jimmy Carpenter. Also involved were Wesley Steed, Wildfire Risk Management Coordinator, and Amber Simpson, Wildfire Prevention Coordinator. These dedicated folks have made Enterprise an example of how small communities across the N.W.T. can reduce the risks posed by wildfires. I want to join the Minister of ENR in congratulating them on their achievement. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ika Goodan and then Member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on the issue of project planning and reviews, both are essential tools to achieving project goals and objectives. Mr. Speaker, the construction of the new Stanton Territorial Hospital, a public-private partnership project. The pre-mortgage construction phase is currently underway and creating a significant amount of benefits. Capitalizing on these benefits is also essential and expected of this government. Mr. Speaker, more specifically, in the area of accumulated apprenticeship hours by the Northern Trades Profession individuals and trainees, the N.W.T. Apprenticeship Trades and Occupational Certification Strategy 2017-2022 strategy that is designed in creating benefits from this project. It will be gratifying to reflect on project completion day on the career differences the strategy has made for the individuals that are currently employed. Mr. Speaker, later I will have questions to the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. Merci.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ika Goodan and then Member Yellowknife North.
Mr. Speaker, today I'd like to speak about our royalty regime. I think we recognize that while we are working toward economic diversification, that for now the N.W.T. economy relies significantly on mining. Aside from the training and jobs that mining provides, we benefit from the royalties and taxes that industry pays to the government. But how are royalties calculated? Are they consistent from one region to the next? How transparent is industry regarding what it pays? How effectively does government manage its side of the relationship? Are we being transparent enough? Mr. Speaker, a recent presentation on this subject certainly grabbed my attention. The report, How to Lose $1 Billion, comes from a new movement called Publish What You Pay. This is a global network of civil society organizations that work towards transparency and openness in the global resource sector, including royalties and taxes. Along with other industry representative groups, they launched the Resource Revenue Transparency Working Group in 2012. Their work with government resulted in the Extractive Sector Transparency Measures Act in 2015. The resulting website lists mining companies and the payments they make to governments in Canada, including Indigenous governments. This new openness by the extractive industry has resulted in improved transparency and accountability. It contributes to effective legislation and a stronger, more trusting partnership between industry and public governments. This was the focus of an address at the recent Roundup conference in Vancouver. Chief Dr. Robert Joseph, co-founder of Reconciliation Canada, spoke about the importance of positive relationships and sharing between Indigenous people and the mining industry. Figures from the N.W.T. Chamber of Mines show that companies in our region already have that focus. Our diamond mines have provided over $5 billion to Indigenous business, over 26,000 person-years of northern employment, half Indigenous, and over $100 million in community contributions, not to mention taxes collected by all levels of government. Mr. Speaker, industry is doing its part. It's government that should be doing a better job. We currently don't provide an annual report compiling details of royalties, taxes, or other payments made to various levels of government. We should offer a concise report summarizing those figures and outlining the benefit of mining in the North. This would offer clear accountability and important detail to members of this Assembly and the public. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement. Thank you.
Merci. Members seeking unanimous consent to conclude his statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, colleagues. Mr. Speaker, we are developing our own Mineral Resource Act as we speak. Northerners need to be confident that we are gaining our fair share of the pie when it comes to resource development. Let's make sure we continue to build respectful, accountable, productive partnerships through open and transparent accountability. I will have questions for the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment at the appropriate time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ikegodan and the member N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, economic development opportunities in N.W.T. are difficult to come by. My constituents have told me that they are struggling to find work, contracts, and opportunities. While the Nuvik to Tuktoyaktuk Highway is expected to bring some economic benefits to Tuktoyaktuk, my other communities of Paulatuk, Sax Harbor, and YELLOWKNIFE needs jobs and a sustainable economy as well. Our communities are filled with skilled, hardworking people, and we a thriving, productive workforce if there are opportunities created and supported. Government programs like the Small Community Employment Support Program are needed to build upon the skills and strengths of our communities. N.W.T. offers the world a truly northern experience unlike no other place in Canada. We have our on-the-land tours, traditional harvesting practices, and traditional art, music, literature, dancing, and languages. The Government of Northwest Territories' investment in these fields isn't only an opportunity to foster straight business growth, it is also a way to cultivate the knowledge economy to secondary or post-secondary exchange students. Research and new ventures in scientific communities, also, Mr. Speaker, our culture and incredible people are the key to creating a resilient future for our region, which is also valuable to visitors and new friends from around the world. The more people who experience the Arctic firsthand, and the more people will return to the Arctic and understand the need to protect its landscapes and support its peoples. And speaking of tourism and the northern experience, we can learn from our neighbors in the Yukon. Their famous sourdough cocktail, which has garnered international attention, generates at least $80,000 in revenue each year and has been on the bucket list of many. It's unique, distinctive, and unforgettable. Mr. Speaker, as our Premier has said, we need economic development opportunities. I'm making myself available to work with the government and our local leaders and businesses to identify what investment opportunities exist or could be created in order to provide support for entrepreneurs so that our residents can chart their own paths to self-sufficiency and create local jobs. We also have suggestions to help the government break down its requests for proposals on any public works in smaller pieces to allow for small businesses to be able to compete on bids and win contracts, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the traditional economy plays a major role in my region. I believe we need to set an example of Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous and local knowledge that the Government of Canada will recognize, as well as governments around the world. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Goodin and the member Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I spoke on the importance of the arts and the need for further investment. But let it be known that that does not take away from my deep admiration for those who participate in sport, physical activity, and recreation. It is on that note that I would like to give special recognition to those Northerners who are participating in the largest display of athletic ability in the world, the 2018 Winter Olympic Games in Pyeongchang, South Korea. Sport brings the world together in celebration of excellence. It is with the deepest pride and greatest pleasure that I congratulate our Northern athletes Brendan Green, Jesse Cockney, and Kevin Cooey, who will be competing for Team Canada at these Olympic Games. Mr. Speaker, Hay River's Brendan Green, who my honourable friend from Hay River North spoke of earlier today, will be competing in the men's biathlon events, while Yellowknife's Jesse Cockney will be demonstrating his abilities in skiing and cross-country skiing. And though our legendary curler Kevin Cooey now lives in Alberta, he will always be one of our own. Enduring and thriving in winter are traits that all Northerners share, but it takes a unique set of skills to be able to translate that into a level of athleticism that these three individuals will be demonstrating on the world stage. We can be assured that their legacy will keep them as champions and role models in the eyes of Northerners for generations to come. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Goodin and the member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I called on the government to pursue new major projects that will create jobs for the hardworking people of the Mackenzie Delta. Today I want to continue on that theme of employment, but at the other end of the scale, the small initiatives and training opportunities that can supplement the benefits of major projects. Residents of Fort McPherson have an idea. They've told me that prospector training, like the sessions government supported in Yellowknife and Hay River last year, would deliver a useful skill boost in the region. In its mandate, the government commits to supporting Aboriginal governments to build capacity in dealing with mining-related activities. And we've heard many times from Cabinet that resource development is critical to local and territorial growth. Mr. Speaker, look at Cabinet and staff's recent attendance at the AME Mineral Roundup in Vancouver for just one example. These are exciting times and exciting opportunities, Mr. Speaker. To take advantage of that, I'd like to see the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment collaborate with Aboriginal governments in the Mackenzie Delta to bring prospector training options to the region. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll have questions later today.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Goodin and the member Tuna de Willade.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today, I speak today about the passing of Elder Violet H. Bolio of Fort Resolution. Violet was raised in a mission school where she lived until she married Jonas on January 12, 1953. Violet was a very loving, dedicated woman who raised a family of 9. She also is involved in various community-focused and youth-oriented initiatives, and she worked on both committees and councils in Fort Resolution. Violet was born in Old Fort Ray on April 5, 1932, and sadly passed away on October 20th, 2017 at age 85. Violet was a very healthy elder, but unfortunately she was killed in a car accident. Violet is predeceased by her husband Jonas and her 3 sons Stephen, Morris, Gregory, her brother Charles, and her granddaughter Delta. Violet is survived by 3 siblings, Marlene, Stuart, and Margaret. 6 children, Mildred McQuinn, Gladys Morin, Lucille Harrington, Brenda Mackay, Larry Bolio, and Myra Pasanwich. Violet loved spending time with her 13 grandchildren, 24 great-grandchildren, and 1 great-great-grandson, who is also the son of our speaker. Grandson of our speaker, pardon me. Violet was a devoted wife and mother. She was a role model and an inspiration for all who knew her. Violet was a very strong person. I visited with her on many occasions and could listen to her speak for as long as she wanted to speak. But she always was kept busy and felt she needed to do something and was always on the go. I would like to take this opportunity to extend my condolences to Violet's family, friends, and all of the people of Fort Resolution. Merci Cho, Mr. Speaker.
Our condolences goes out to the family as well. Merci. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Yellowknife Center.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce my partner, Janice McKenna, owner and operator of McKenna Funeral Home. And with her is Mr. Todd Reinhold of Edmonton. He is a specialist in grief and healing grief. He presented a public seminar on that topic in Yellowknife last night. Masi.
Masi. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Oral questions. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier I spoke about employment in N.W.T, and my questions are for the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment. Mr. Speaker, my first question is, what has the Department of Industry, Tourism and Investment done or willing to do in order to help existing N.W.T culture become a source of employment and revenue? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Department of ITI has worked extensively in all regions to promote these exact things across our territory. In his particular writing, the department has two economic development officers in his writing, one in Tuktoyaktuk and one in Ulaartuk. They're on the ground there, the members writing to promote our programs in the region and be able to facilitate and steer clients to areas that support funding that suits their needs for their local region. The seed policy is there to gear towards regional and community applications, and I think it's a great program. And if there's any other questions the member has around that particular issue, I'll gladly sit down with them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Akira Cassie, member N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the response. Mr. Speaker, my second question for the Minister is, what has the government done so far to recruit and train or involve locals in the tourism industry? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Mr. Speaker, in particular, as of late, I think the big tourism opportunities that have been there locally is around the cruise ship industries. Our staff have been in there the last 2 years when these ships come into the region and support economic development in the region and spend their money. Our staff is there to help facilitate that. I think we've actually even have used our programs to help facilitate providing opportunities around the business opportunities with such a large influx of people that will come to shore when these boats come to town. But as I've said, we have our two economic development officers that are in the region to help facilitate these sorts of things going forward, not just around the cruise industry, but other types of tourism, be it hunting or guiding and these types of things, and we will always reach out to help facilitate that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tada Cassie, member N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Very useful information. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister work with the Minister responsible for education, culture, employment, and Inuvialuit Regional Corporation in order to create or build upon our community's employment potential within tourism and the creation of a possible deep water port or small craft harbor? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd gladly sit down and have a discussion with all the leadership around the potential of a deep water port in the Beaufort Delta region. I know it's something that's clearly on the minds of people in the Tuktoyaktuk community for sure. I've had casual conversations about that and how we can try to initiate and move that forward and how it can actually stir more economic development in the region and for the territory as a whole, depending on our approach to it. I'm sure it's on the federal government's mind as well as around sovereignty issues for the region and protecting the coastline. As we know, we have the largest coastline in North America, and the big chunk of it is in the member's writing. So I would gladly sit down and have that discussion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, N.W.T, Cassie, member N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the Minister's openness and willing to work with Indigenous governments as well as other departments in the N.W.T. Mr. Speaker, earlier I spoke about the Yukon sour toe and how little things like that generate revenue in the Yukon. And Mr. Speaker, my final question for the Minister is: the Minister willing to donate a toe for a better knockoff of the Yukon's famous cocktail, which could potentially create revenue for generations to come?
Just say yes.
Mr. Speaker, please consider a minister's toe versus a stranger's toe could generate a large difference in revenue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
That's a weird question, but anyways, Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think I'll defer that question to the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. He toes the line more than I do in this assembly. But I believe his toe might be cheaper than mine, so the upfront costs will be a little bit better and revenues will be higher. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Masi. Oral question, Yikada County, the member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't know how I'm going to match that. Mr. Speaker, today I talked about Guthrie House and inmates that, have trauma and addictions and that. So my questions are to the Minister of Justice. In regards to dealing with inmates with trauma and addictions, can the Minister please tell us what the department does to help inmates deal with these matters while they're incarcerated? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Justice.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's no doubt that many of those that do end up incarcerated do have issues with trauma and addictions. I can advise that corrections staff have attended training and workshops on trauma-informed practices to assist them in working with inmates who have experienced trauma, which would be a pretty high percentage of those that are incarcerated. I can advise also that, along with facility psychologists, Corrections has an addiction counselor on staff at South Mackenzie Correctional Centre, and traditional counselors and liaison officers are on staff at both SMCC and North Slave Correctional Centre. In addition, the Corrections Services has implemented several programs, including substance abuse management, violence prevention, living without violence, and respectful relationships designed to help inmates. So those are some of the programs that are being used in our corrections facilities, and as I say, we do recognize that a very high percentage of those that do end up being incarcerated do have trauma in their lives and also suffer from addictions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Cassie, member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that nice answer. Kind of led into my other question that I've already was going to ask. But so when he talks about these, programs and having staff on this in the corrections, there, do we have psychologists and addiction counselors in each of the treatment or each of our correction entities? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I can advise that psychologists are on staff at North Slave Correctional Complex and the South Mackenzie Correctional Centre, providing psychological services to inmates. And at the Fort Smith Correctional Complex, on-call psychological services are available. Fort Smith Correctional Centre is entering into a recruitment process for a full-time counselor. So the corrections psychological services are also made available to those on probation on an as-needed basis. And I can advise also that along with the facility psychologist I've referenced previously, Corrections has an addictions counselor on staff at SMCC and traditional counselors and liaison officers on staff at both SMCC and NSCC. Substance abuse and violence programs are offered at all facilities and most probation offices. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie, member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the Minister's answer and a little bit more in depth. It's good to see that we're doing those things. So, my next question is, Mr. Speaker, has the department looked at the Guthrie House model and seen if it's feasible to implement this type of model in the Northwest Territories? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Justice.
Yes, many of us, along with staff, did have the opportunity of going to Guthrie House, and I think we were all impressed by what we saw and heard there. So there were 2 site visits to the Guthrie Therapeutic Community in Nanaimo, British Columbia, have been conducted. We met staff and inmates, and as I say, I think we were all impressed from what we heard from both staff and inmates. So the Corrections Service has established a committee to examine the feasibility of implementing a therapeutic community model for addictions in the South Mackenzie Correctional Center. So we are researching the issue. We are contemplating the number of inmates that might avail themselves of this type of program, and also looking at changes that might be required to the physical plant, the facility itself. So yes, this issue is being carefully examined. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question. Member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. And I've had conversations with them previously, and I'm very encouraged to see this happening. So, Mr. Speaker, what were some of the things that they saw that can be implemented right away for the betterment of our inmates that we saw at the Guthrie House? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Justice.
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, I think we were both very impressed with both staff and the inmates at the Guthrie House. I can advise that the department is currently in the final stages of curriculum development for the pre-treatment healing addictions programs to be facilitated out of SMCC. So we went down to Nanaimo, we listened and learned, and we are making progress in this important matter. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. The member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'm not going to, I have some questions for the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. I'm not going to ask for his head, hands, feet. I just want a little bit of his time and money. The current staffing of the N.W.T. Arts Council deals with more than 120 applications a year, requesting about $1.5 million against a budget of $600,000. There are 2 application deadlines a year, and staff can barely keep up. There has been no increase in the N.W.T. Arts Council budget for 10 years, and there's nothing in the budget that was tabled by the Finance Minister yesterday. Can the Minister tell us what will trigger an increase in the budget and capacity of the N.W.T. Arts Council? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Currently, there is no trigger to look at what will help determine an increase in the budget. As I mentioned yesterday, when it comes to supporting the arts in the Northwest Territories, collectively as a government, we're looking at what all of our supports are within the departments. I also just want to point out, Mr. Speaker, that my department, Department of ECE, is the second highest per capita rate in Canada when it comes to providing support for the arts, culture, and heritage here in the Northwest Territories. And every year we serve approximately 250 clients in the Northwest Territories on a yearly basis. That has helped foster some very healthy relationships when it comes to supporting arts in the N.W.T. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. I'm just glad that no one put their foot in their mouth on these questions. Oral question. Nakita Cassie, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I don't think I can top that. And I appreciate the response from the Minister, and I know staff work hard to get money out the door and so on, but we could be accessing a lot more of federal funding as well. So there are over 15 funding programs listed on the Heritage Canada website that could be used to support arts activities and initiatives in the N.W.T. They cover everything from performing arts to capital investment opportunities. Can the Minister give us a snapshot of what federal program and capital funding the N.W.T. received this year for arts-related activities and projects? Merci, Mr. Speaker. And I did give him a heads up so he knows about this. Thanks.
Merci. Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And any support that we get from third parties or any of our partners in terms of supporting our culture, our heritage, and arts programs here in the Northwest Territories is greatly appreciated, and I know our staff work very hard to try to access those funds. However, I don't have that information on hand with me right now, but once I do get that information, I will be happy to share it with the member and committee and all members that are interested in knowing how much we're supporting the artists in the Northwest Territories and accessing other sources of funding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tada Dayakasi, Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks again to the Minister for that commitment, and he'll pull together the information. We'll get it. The currently prevailing plan for promotion of the arts is 2004 N.W.T. Arts Strategy, and it states as its goal, quote, the coordination of programs and services that will ensure more effective and efficient use of available funds, end of quote. As a means of achieving this goal, will the Minister commit to examine the amalgamation of all GNWT arts funding, production, and marketing programs under the leadership of an arm's-length NWT Arts Council? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do agree the NWT Arts Council does play a very important role as an advisory board to myself as Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. I did mention yesterday that I will be working with the Minister of ITI to look at options moving forward in terms of whether it's a strategy or how we can work better together and more collaborative, and obviously having the NWT Arts Council play a pivotal role in that. They're the ones that we assign to the boards, and they're the ones with the expertise that also help give us direction on how these funds are being allocated throughout the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundida Ekasi, Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. And once again, I'd like to thank the Minister for his response. That's good news. Yesterday, he committed to reviewing GNWT support for the arts, and he's made some additional commitments, in my view, here today. So I really hope that this review is going to be more than just pulling together the current support across at least two departments and then concluding that everything is just fine. Clearly, structural change is needed to bring in improved focus to this sector and better leverage federal funding. Can the Minister tell us just what he's going to review with regard to support for the arts and when he will report back publicly? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I did mention that we're working with the departments to see what the overall supports that the GNWT as a whole gives to the arts community, as well as culture and heritage. And once we get those numbers, we can start having further discussions moving forward. But that work has to be done first, and currently I don't have a timeline, but as soon as we get that information, we will be sharing with members. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Ikeda Canada, Member Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Health and Social Services. Although the measures I discussed in my member statement, I realize straddle both health and finance responsibilities. But the primary purpose of my suggestions is to reduce alcohol harm rather than to increase revenue from alcohol sales generally. So my first suggestion is about reducing liquor store hours, since longer opening hours are related to both impaired driving and hospital-related hospitalization. So will the Minister work with his colleague, the Minister of Finance, to examine the reduction in the hours that liquor stores are open? Merci.
Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this morning I did have an opportunity to talk with the honourable member from YK Centre about the report that she mentioned in her statement. I have to admit, I do spend a significant amount of my time reading reports and other documents, but I have not read the report that the member made reference to this morning. I can confirm that the department is very familiar with the report, has read it, and that type of research is helping inform the development of the Addictions Recovery Action Plan that we spoke about yesterday. I understand the value of harm reduction reduction. I understand the value in doing things to prevent chronic addictions and other things that we face here in the Northwest Territories. So today I'll commit to the member that I will share the report with the Minister of Finance and the N.W.T. Liquor Commission, so that if and when it comes to time to reprice alcohol here in the Northwest Territories and review hours of operations, that they have that data to help them make evidence-based decisions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Let's see. Oral question, the Kitare Cassie member, YELLOWKNIFE Center.
Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the frankness of the minister's response and appreciate that he'll make time to read this report. I'm hoping that the pricing question, as well as the liquor store open hours question, will come up sooner rather than later. As I mentioned, indexing the cost of alcohol to both alcohol content and to inflation makes sure that alcohol remains an expensive product for people to use. Will the minister review these options and again consult with the Minister of Finance on increasing prices to reflect alcohol impact? Thank you.
Let's see. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe that we have some of the highest priced alcohol in the country at this point, but the report has some valuable information, and as I've already indicated, I will be sharing that information with the Minister of Finance as well as the N.W.T. Liquor Commission so that they can make evidence-based decisions if and when the opportunity comes to review liquor pricing here in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Let's see. Oral question, Tadade Cassie member, YELLOWKNIFE Center.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to my colleague, the Minister of Health. While our prices may be high, our alcohol harm is also high, so I don't think we should rule that out as a possibility. Another possibility that came out of the report, one that is totally within the discretion of the Minister of Health, is to have clinicians screen their patients to identify harmful drinking patterns. The screening, it's a few questions that is then followed with a very brief counseling session aimed at increasing the awareness of heavy drinking and referral to care. Will the Minister investigate the implementation of this protocol? Thank you.
Let's see. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, hospitalizations entirely caused by alcohol is an effective measure of the effectiveness of prevention and treatment programs and provides for evidence-based decision-making. The abuse of alcohol is a cause or a contributing factor in a number of health conditions and is a leading factor of preventable death and disease. Currently, the Department of Health and Services tracks that data, and we will continue to track that indicator, hospitalizations entirely caused by alcohol. The department will be reporting, just for note, the department will be reporting on this indicator in the 2016-2017 annual report, which is actually scheduled to be tabled during this session. The department also made reference to this indicator in the 2018-19 business plan, and it was something that we discussed with members previously. In 2015-2016, the N.W.T. rate of hospitalizations caused by alcohol was over 5 times the national average. There hasn't been any statistically significant changes in that rate since 2004-2005. The report that the honourable member is mentioning has been shared and is a part of the documents that is being utilized to help inform our addictions recovery action plan. So that information the member is bringing up will be something that we're looking at in moving forward with this plan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Let's see. Oral question, Nundere Cassie member, YELLOWKNIFE Center.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the Minister's response. It's not really the response to my question, but I understand he's engaged with this indicator. I think the fact there's been no statistical change in the amount of hospitalization due entirely to drinking is a reason to look at new approaches, and one of those is having clinicians do this pre-screening to identify and offer solutions for heavy drinking. Is the Minister prepared to look at this initiative? Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the development of the Addictions Recovery Action Plan, this is the type of thing that we need to be talking about. We need to be talking about new opportunities, new ways of doing business. Harm reduction is an evolving and very interesting way of addressing many of the challenges that our residents face, and we need to be open to it. So I don't want to presuppose a solution, but this is the type of thing that we're hoping to see in the Addictions Recovery Action Plan. So, in short, I'm not going to commit to this as an exact model, but this is the type of model we want to look at. This could be, but we need to finish our work, frankly, and we need to continue to move forward, and our minds need to be open to new approaches. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nikada Canada, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions today are for the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment. I spoke earlier today about royalties and transparency around royalties. Mr. Speaker, we know that industry is doing a good job, and they are working with organizations like Publish What You Pay to be a little bit more transparent. We know also that other jurisdictions, provinces, are publishing annual reports on the revenues and benefits that they receive from the mining industry. So I'd like to ask the Minister today, when or will the N.W.T publish each year the amounts of royalties and taxes and other payments to governments by companies in the mining and oil and gas sectors? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and the member is correct that we don't do that. It's the complete number is shared as a whole in our books. But this is a conversation since devolution has taken place that we need to have with all residents of the Northwest Territories. It's a very important one that we have to take, and royalties directly impact the profitability of these mines. And we know we want to get our fair share, but at the same time we have to protect the industry that we have in the Northwest Territories so residents can benefit from these economic opportunities. And we will continue to look at this as we move forward. It has been separated out of the Mineral Resource Act because we know this is a very big conversation that needs to take place with the residents. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nikada Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for his reply. The Minister alluded to the fact that we are undertaking the development of the Mineral Resource Act right now. We've been doing some consulting in regard to that, but more specifically, I'm talking about our royalties regime and the taxation regime. I appreciate that the Minister has indicated that there's some work to be done around that, but I guess the question then is when? When will the government consult with Indigenous governments and the public, for that matter, about possible changes to our taxes and royalties? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've already had some discussions when we brought the Mineral Resource Act legislation to the Intergovernmental Council, which looks at lands and resources of the Northwest Territories. The Premier sits down with them, and we've had that discussion. They've agreed with us that we need to pull this out and have a separate conversation about it, and that's why it's not a part of the Mineral Resource Act. We want to make sure we get both of these things right, as they're very important to the residents of the Northwest Territories. And you know, there's more than just the royalty side of it. When we have these discussions, people have to look at the whole framework as a whole and consider the fiscal context of this conversation, because there's a lot of misinformation out there that when you start talking about royalties and what these mining companies pay, there's a big difference between one province, from one province to province to territory to the other, and there's a lot of things that need to take place. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadade Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, I appreciate the complexity of this issue, but I didn't really hear from the Minister as to when we're going to undertake this. But I'm going to move ahead for a moment, and I think we all recognize that non-renewable resources are very important. In fact, when we extract them, then that's it, they're gone. And so I just want to know from the Minister, what work has N.W.T done since devolution to evaluate our resource tax and royalty regime to ensure that we are both encouraging development but also getting our fair share for extraction of publicly owned resources? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's exactly what we're doing. As all members of this House know, we're moving forward with the Mineral Resource Act since devolution. We want to make this a leading edge, made in the North Act that will benefit all Northerners. And with discussions with the Intergovernmental Council, it was decided that this needs a very detailed, comprehensive review of the royalty side of things. This is something that the legislation that we inherited from the federal government. The last time I believe it was updated when it was in their hands was in 2007, 2008 roughly. My understanding is most jurisdictions do a 10-year review, but that's not saying that's what we're going to do. We've already said that we want to have a review of this, just that we've separated it out from the Mineral Resource Act, and it has to have its own separate conversation with all residents and industry in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere Ekasi, member Yellowknife North.
Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for the additional information. I guess then I would like to ask the Minister about maybe how much it is that we are receiving, and does the Minister feel that it's a fair portion? It's estimated that the N.W.T. receives a little over 20% of the resource revenues. Does the government plan to increase the future revenue rates, or do they think that that 20% is fair as is? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can't tell you exactly the percentage that we get. I would have to get the details from the department, but I can reassure members in this House that we are about right down the middle of the pipe here with the rest of the countries, particularly around the regions that surround the Northwest Territories. And as I've said, we got to take into the context when we have this review, we have to be able to look at the whole picture and bring in everybody to have this conversation, be it fuel tax, property taxes, the future of carbon tax in the industry, the lack of infrastructure in the Northwest Territories. We are very fortunate to have the mines that we do have right now where they can take their commodity out in a suitcase. But as that context rolls out, where do we want to go with this industry in the Northwest Territories? And that's a conversation that we're going to have in this House, but also with all residents. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Hikada Academy, the member South 2.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Following up on my statement there, my question today is to the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment on the N.W.T. Apprenticeship Trades and Occupational Certification Strategy. Can the Minister confirm if there has been any discussions with BHP, the prime contractor for the Stanton Hospital, on efforts to meeting the objectives as set out in the strategy? Merci.
Merci. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as members know, we did release the Apprenticeship Trades and Occupation Certification Strategy in May of last year. The implementation of the strategy is being guided by the Advisory Committee as well as working groups comprised largely of industry stakeholders. So I think it's about time that we do get an update. So we will be working with the working groups as well as the Advisory Committee to get an update, and we'll be happy to share that information with the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Akita Cassie, member South 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks for the response to the Minister here. My next question is, in the issuance of the RFP at the beginning of this project, was there targets set to achieve X amount of tradesperson within the project? Thank you.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And one of the focuses of the ATOC strategy is to create jobs for Northern residents where opportunities provide themselves. And I think the project for Stans was a big part of that, or any of our industry opportunities where our Northerners can get jobs in the industry field. Specifically for the Stans project, I'm not sure if there were targets set, but I can find that out from my other colleagues here and get back to the member. But with the ATOC strategy, when we did release it, we wanted to increase participation in the skills, trades, and occupations, as well as improving completion rates of anybody that was in the apprenticeship going through, that were apprentices or journeymen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Tado de Akasi, Member Satu.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to hear that the departments are working with the other departments on the other side here to try to achieve the goals as set out in the first RFP process during the procurement. My next question is related to hearing the minister will provide the information. Would the minister also include in the information what was targeted in the request or the RFP and how much it has produced to date in terms of apprentice trades accomplishing their hours? Merci.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, a strong labor market is critical to N.W.T's economic future. We know that there's jobs out there. We have projects that are on the go throughout the Northwest Territories, and we want to provide the skills, the opportunities for Northerners to fill those jobs and be certified and be ready when new opportunities come up. Specifically for that project, like I said, I don't know the numbers or if there was actually rates and targets that were set, but I can find out that information and get back to the member. But with all large projects in the N.W.T, we obviously want to have Northerners fill those positions, and with the ATOC strategy, we're making sure that they have the skills that are needed, the training that's needed, so that they can fill those opportunities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Nundere Akasi, Member Satu.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. I would like the minister to confirm that narrowing it down to 4 different trades, if that information could be included, 3rd and 4th year apprentice individuals for electricians, plumbers, and pipe fitters, and also include drywallers as well in the report that he's going to provide. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And presently, we have about 389 apprentices registered in the Northwest Territories. There's also 92 journey person certifications that were issued in the 15-16 fiscal year, 73 more in 16-17, and 54 journey person certificates issued to date in the 17-18 fiscal year. So we do have some of that information, and we can share that information with the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Hikara Canada, Member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have a few questions for Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment. Follow-up to my member's statement. I'd like to ask the Minister, when was the last time government supported prospector training that was held outside the North or South Slave regions? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member's right. The last few courses have been in the north and south of the region of the Northwest Territories for geological resources that exist in this particular region because of the high mining activity. What I can tell the member, though, is the last one that we did have, we had members from the SAT2 participate that came down, and they accessed the SEED program to be able to participate in that. And that's an option that, depending on where the next one is, that we can actually reach out to the member to do that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Akita Akasi, Member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what can the minister do to support Aboriginal governments that want to bring prospector training to their communities? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We can certainly work with any local government or Aboriginal organizations or communities that want to bring prospector training to their community. One of the challenges we face, though, is geologists and prospectors, instructors may be familiar with rocks in a particular area, and the learning experience needs to be one that's going to benefit the students. One of the things I think that we need to really look at, particularly maybe in that region as things move forward to try to find an industry for the Bodell, is maybe we have some type of regional collaboration with communities and have a look at that and have a more robust group of people participating. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tada Cassie, member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, will we see prospector training offered in the Mackenzie Delta within this calendar year? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, if we can have a look at this possibly as a regional approach, I don't believe we have anything scheduled in the coming year as yet. We are still in the planning stages, and some of this investment that we will need to do is going to be hinged on the budget process as well, Mr. Speaker, but we can certainly have those conversations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Ikeda Canada, member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I was pleased to see the honourable member from Yellowknife North speaking about very important issues to me, both mining and transparency. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Transparency some questions around transparency over the royalty regime and the benefits the mining sector is paying into the Northwest Territories. In the federal context, there is a piece of legislation called the Extractive Sector Transparency Measures Act. And this act has created a federal government website that you can look up mining companies and see what payments they have been making to governments, including this government. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Transparency if he is willing to begin work on a similar piece of legislation for our government that would allow transparency over royalty resources in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister responsible for public engagement and transparency.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a complex issue, of course, and I certainly would want to discuss this with my colleagues. My understanding was that in the last year there was approximately $83 million of royalties obtained from the mining industry in the Northwest Territories. And however, there is not an individual breakdown from individual mining companies. I think in the past they've resisted that for the reason that they didn't want to be sharing that kind of information with competitors, because royalty regimes and rates are based often on gross production or profits. So traditionally in the past they have not wanted to share that with the public or with competitors, but I think that as Minister of Transparency we have to at least look at this issue. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question, Nikita Cassie, member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'll remind the Honourable Minister that we're the ones who make the rules for the industry. They don't make the rules for themselves. And the industry seems to be quite fine to have this information published on a federal website, which includes payments made to the N.W.T and to Indigenous organizations within the Northwest Territories. So if he's not willing to move forward on legislation, will he begin the work on a clear annual statement on how much royalties were received, how much were shared with each Indigenous group, and that this report be tabled annually in the Legislative Assembly? Will he make that commitment? Thank you.
Minister responsible for public engagement and transparency.
I don't think I could make that kind of commitment at this time, because the royalty regimes, which are an important part of our revenues, as I say, we do know what the gross amount is. The question is, are we getting, or how much we are getting from each individual mine. As I say, in the past, mines, both here and I think in most other jurisdictions, have not been willing to share that information. Some of the information can be obtained through other countries, I see, by looking at the overall profits of the parent companies, but I don't think the mines in the Northwest Territories that are generally subsidiaries of very large international corporations would be willing to share that information, because they would see that as giving information to their competitors and perhaps affecting their competitiveness. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tada Cassie, member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I always appreciate impassioned defenses of secrecy from the Minister of Public Engagement and Transparency. So the Chamber of Mines here in the Northwest Territories currently produces reports and does this work to roll up royalty information. If the minister's not willing to bring forward legislation or table a report, will he at least give a contribution to the Chamber of Mines to do this work on his behalf? Thank you.
Minister responsible for public engagement and transparency.
I'm not sure whether the request is for a personal donation or a government donation, but... Government! Okay. No, I realize this is a serious issue. I was just, when the previous questions were asked of the Minister of ITI, I was looking at something called the Bauer Report, which does go into some of the very complex issues surrounding this whole issue of royalty. I can advise that I will be looking at that further and discussing that report and its findings with my colleagues. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question. Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to be clear, we're not talking about reviewing the royalty regime. We're talking about publishing the financial transparency around the economic contributions the mining industry is making to the Northwest Territories and to this government. This is something the mining industry does in other jurisdictions. This is something the Chamber of Mines assists with in other jurisdictions. I am asking the Minister of Transparency if he can help be a leader on fiscal transparency as it relates to the extractive sector, either through legislation, either through annual reporting, or either through contributions to the Chamber of Mines to allow this reporting to be done by the private sector. Will he do any of that, or something else that's tangible, so we can get these facts brought forward so residents of the Northwest Territories can clearly see and celebrate the immense and tremendous contribution that the mining industry and natural resources make to the economic health and well-being of this territory. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister responsible for public engagement and transparency.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I think we're all aware of the great contribution that the mines do make to our economy and society. We know that as a gross figure, as I understand it, looking at the Bauer report, I think there was an estimate of approximately $83 million paid in royalties to the government of the Northwest Territories in the 2017 year. Plus, as they also pay many other taxes, land leases, and so on. So they do make a huge contribution. I think that before I make any commitment to have the royalties broken down per mine, which I understand is the request from the member opposite, I would have to see what our arrangements were, whether that would be allowed. I do agree that as a matter of transparency, excuse me, it would be better if those facts were known. But we do live in a competitive world, competitive society, and the mines to this point have been adverse to releasing that kind of documentation to us. I don't know whether they have a commitment from us that we will not seek that kind of information, but I am willing to look into the matter. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On February 2nd, Transport Canada announced that the N.W.T Fisheries and Marine Training Consortium will establish a marine training facility in Hay River through partnership with the N.W.T. Apparently, this is part of a 3-year, $12.6 million federal investment under the Oceans Protection Plan. Mr. Speaker, I usually know what's happening in my backyard, but I haven't received any communication about this initiative. It's news to me. I just learned about it when the Minister of Infrastructure responded to questions about MTS earlier this week. I don't know where this facility will be set up, or when it will be operating, or if it's operating already. Hopefully ITI or infrastructure will issue a press release or some sort of information in the near future, as I'm already getting media requests about this, and I really don't know much about it. So on its website, the N.W.T Fisheries and Marine Training Consortium states that it offers a variety of training, deckhand, marine mechanic, bridge officer, fishing masters, etc. So what types of training will be offered in Hay River? And if the minister is willing, would he please specify whether or not locals will be engaged in the development of this curriculum? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism, and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member said, I mentioned it yesterday in the House. These are very early days for the Marine Training Centre that the N.W.T Fisheries and Marine Training Consortium has come forward with to locate in our riding in Hay River, which is great news for our constituents in Hay River and all residents of the Northwest Territories to be able to access a program such as this. Presently, right now, there's a needs assessment underway for courses that are appropriate for the required training. As These guys operate out of Nunavut, now moving to the Northwest Territories. They're going to have a look at the situation in N.W.T. around the fishers and in particular the marine transportation services that we run up and down the river. My understanding already this spring, though, the courses that are intended to roll out is right away is going to help the fishers with a small vehicle vessel operators course, which is going to benefit the fishermen. And you got to remember, these are Transport Canada certified courses, so this ticket will be good right across the country. But then we will also hopefully get our staff in there from the Marine Transportation Services Tugs and Barge system to be able to access these programs as well and get them to benefit from that. I think once that rolls out I think can get things a little bit of water under their feet, so to speak. The general public will be able to take some of these courses and they will expand as they see necessary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Minister is right. This is good news for Hay River, so I'm surprised there wasn't a bit of hoopla about it. I'd want to talk about the cost of training. Since the N.W.T employs only a handful of people at MTS, the rest are contracted out. I wonder who will pay for these employees who are employed by the contractor if it's going to have to come out of the employee's own pocket. And then there's the fishermen. Will the training be paid through paid for through the revitalization strategy? There's a lot of questions. So considering all that, what will the costs of training be, and who will pay for the training? Thank you.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, this is a course that's fully funded by Transport Canada. The costs will be totally absorbed by Transport Canada. It'll be an application-based process, and screening will be made to suitable candidates that will be able to take these courses. And once the applicant is accepted, there will be no cost to the students. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, let's talk jobs. That's what everyone's talking about. How many people will be employed by this institute? And more importantly, how many of those positions will be local in Hay River? Thank you.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said, this is early days of this, but from everything that I've heard, got to remember this is a Transport Canada funded program through the Nunavut Fisheries and Marine Training Consortium, so we have little knowledge of what's going on because it's not led by us, but my understanding is expected to have up to 3 instructors starting out presently. That may grow over as demand is increased. They are willing to hire local people to facilitate this and put on the instructing courses. And if we can't find any people within Hay River or the Northwest Territories to do that, my understanding is the consortium is willing to train N.W.T individuals to be able to do this. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This all sounds great. And to be honest, I'm not even sure who I'm talking to right now, if it's a Minister of ITI or the Minister of Infrastructure. I don't know who's the lead on this. And so I'd like to hope they get this information out there for public consumption. So my last question is, how many people will be put through this institution? How many people will be trained per year or per season or whatever the measure may be? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said, this is early days in this process. They're rolling out with 3 instructors, and as demand fluctuates up or down, I guess that will depend on the market and the need for this type of training. I wouldn't be surprised even if we see people from outside our jurisdiction who possibly want to get into the marine industry come and enroll in this program once they find out it's there. But as I said, this is early days, and we'll have to see what it brings. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral questions. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I was asking questions to the Minister of Health and Social Services about the treatment centres, and I'd like to follow up with some additional questions here today. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister please advise us in the past fiscal year how many adults and youth have we sent out for treatment, and what were the associated costs with these programs? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 2016-2017, 212 adults were supported to attend facility-based addiction treatment, and we have an annual budget there of about just slightly under $2.1 million. As I mentioned yesterday, youth attending out-of-service program typically have very complex needs that may include emotional or behavioral issues, mental health concerns. It might be a serious medical diagnosis. It might be developmental delays and or addictions. Youth attending these out-of-territorial programs are supported through Child and Family Services. So we don't specify these individuals are going just for addictions. We have a program for youth that have any number of conditions. And we have a budget in that area, or rather a 2016-17 expenditure of about $7.9 million to support this, recognizing that's not just addictions, that's a wide range of things that we're supporting our youth for. Thank you.
Oral question, Cassie member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that information. And I appreciate with the youth, it's very complex, so I appreciate that number and move forward here. So the next question I have for Minister, Mr. Speaker, is what programs are available to residents before they head off for treatments for their addiction? So what do we do to prepare these people as they're going out for the treatments? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I've said before, as a result of the Mental Health and Addictions Forum, we heard clearly that residents of the Northwest Territories want options and that facility-based treatment is just one option. There are a number of options available to residents that may help support them in their process, which may include preparing them for addictions treatment facilities, but it may not. They may be able to get resolution and the support they need without ever going to an addictions treatment facility. But some of the supports that we do have is we do have community counseling program available in all regions of the Northwest Territories, most communities. We have N.W.T helplines. We have on-the-land programs that are available through Indigenous governments throughout the Northwest Territories. There are a large number of NGOs providing really great services to our residents. There are 12-step programs available through peer support organizations throughout the Northwest Territories supported by Alberta. There are informal supports that our councillors are always encouraging our residents to utilize as appropriate. That can include things like family and friends, community networks, and other activities. There's connection with obviously our primary health care providers. That includes doctors as well as community health nurses throughout our system, and then there's also social services that's available as well. So there are a wide variety of supports available to help people select their path, which may include addictions-based treatment in facilities. My apologies. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question, Cassie member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that great answer. It does help us understand better as we move forward. And then I guess I should have paraphrased it for all people and not just going out for treatment to the facilities, and I thank the Minister for the clarification. So, Mr. Speaker, what is the department doing to help residents that return home from treatment with their aftercare? Because it seems to be when we talk about that, what are we doing? That seems to be a big issue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in our process and referral to addictions-based treatment facilities, before our residents go, they actually have to have a return appointment booked with the counsellor or the referring individual. We can't make people attend, but that is one of the things that's supposed to happen. Prior to release from any of the treatment facilities at the successful completion of their program, the facilities have been working with the residents, but also with counsellors in communities to help set up some aftercare plans. And a lot of those do depend on things like peer support groups, but also the counsellors we have in place and other groups like NGOs that I've previously mentioned that may be able to do it. Recovery support plans are individualized, so every one of them is going to be different based on the individual and what the individual is prepared to or not prepared to do. We do know that there are peer support groups and how valuable, we heard that during the tour, how valuable peer support groups are. And in that light, we do know that we have some challenges around peer support groups, especially in some of our smaller groups, smaller communities, my apologies. After our trip, I did talk to the department. I asked the department to begin some research in how we can better support our peer support groups throughout the Northwest Territories. I know that the Yukon, as an example, has some really interesting programming to provide support to peer support groups. So that work is being done, and I hope to have some discussions with committee on that and how we can better support peer support groups throughout the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. All question. Nundere kasi member nehende.
I thank the minister for that answer. I find it very important, especially with the aftercare. I mean, that's when they're back here in the territory, so I appreciate your answer on that. The other big thing that we find, though, is that about family and the support system that we have here for the people coming back. So my next question to the minister, Mr. Speaker, is what support programs are available for family members and spouses who have loved ones that are attending addiction programs outside the N.W.T? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, during the tour that I attended with the MLAs of the different facilities, this is one of the topics that came up, and I think it's an important topic, and we have to have some more conversation about this and the types of things that we might be able to do to support families of individuals who are struggling with addictions, because it clearly, without question, has an impact not only on the individuals but on the families as well. We do have some supports. Community counseling is available not just to individuals struggling with addictions, but to the families as well. The N.W.T helpline is a support tool that is available to families. Following up on our trip, I did follow up with the department, and the Insight program, which is one of the programs that we talked about at Edgewood, is a 6-day residential program for adults whose loved ones basically suffer from substance abuse disorders. We have in the past funded some of our residents to go down to that program. We're looking at that, whether or not maybe we should have conversations with the facilities we're contracting with about coming up, or maybe additional supports for some of our families to go down. We are exploring that, but we have funded it in the past and we will continue to do so. There's also Al-Anon, which is a peer support network for family and friends of alcoholics. And that program is available in the North at any time, either pre-treatment or after treatment, or when families are just looking for supports for themselves when their family member isn't seeking help. And I would encourage you and all residents who want to learn more about that program to visit the website, the Al-Anon website. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Time for oral questions has expired. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to the Commissioner's opening address. Replies to the Commissioner's opening address. Replies to budget address, day 2 of 7. Replies to budget address, day 2 of 7. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of standing special committee. Reports of standing special committee. Reports of the committee on the review of bills. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, your committee would like to report on its consideration of Bill 1, the Western Canada Lottery Act. Bill 1 received second reading in the Legislative Assembly on October 20th, 2017, and was referred to the Standing Committee on Government Operations for review. Today, I would like to advise the House of the committee's wish to extend our review of the bill with the intention of reporting back to the House on or before February 28th, 2018. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, in accordance with Rule 75, brackets 1, bracket C of the Rules of the Legislative Assembly of the Northwest Territories, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Day Cho, that the review period for Bill 1 be extended to February 28th, 2018. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Motion's in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. The extension to February 28, 2018. Reports of committees on review of bills. Reports on committee on review of bills. Tabling of documents. The Honorable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following letter from Grand Chief George McKenzie of the Tlicho government to myself, Premier MacLeod, dated January 31, 2018, thanking the Government of the Northwest Territories for supporting Indigenous governments in their goals to be self-sustaining and self-reliant by inviting them to participate in events like the AME Roundup Conference in Vancouver last month. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Tabling of documents. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I have two documents I wish to table. The first is a letter dated November the 20th, 2017, signed by over 40 individuals and organizations involved in the arts to Minister of Education, Culture and Employment and the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment regarding funding increase and comprehensive strategy for performing and multimedia arts in the Northwest Territories. Second document, Mr. Speaker, is a letter from the Ministers of Education, Culture and Employment and Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment, dated December the 19th, in reply to the earlier letter on funding increase and comprehensive strategy for performing the multimedia arts in the Northwest Territories. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Tabling of documents. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to table a report with the title Alcohol Harm in Canada, Examining Hospitalizations Entirely Caused by Alcohol and Strategies to Reduce Alcohol Harm. Merci.
Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Motions. Motions. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration Committee of the Whole of bills and other matters. Minister statement 1-18 bracket 3. Table document 63-18 bracket 3. Minister statement 19-18 bracket 3 with member Hay River North in the chair.
We'll now call Committee of the Whole to order. And before I ask the wish of committee, I just want to thank all the pages who've been here with us this week. Thank you for all your hard work. Mr. Bolio, what is the wish of committee?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that the Chair of Committee of the Whole leave the chair and report progress. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. There's a motion to report progress. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will now rise and report progress.
May I have the report, member Hay River North?
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering Minister Statement 1-18 brackets 3 North Slave Correctional Complex inmate concerns, Minister Statement 19-18 brackets 3 Aurora College Foundational Review Progress, Table Document 63-18 brackets 3 Main Estimates 2018-2019. I would like to report progress, and Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with.
Do I have a seconder? Member for Cam Lake. Motion's in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Merci. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Monday, February 12th, 2018, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgements, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to commissioner's opening address, replies to budget address, day 3 of 7, petitions, reports of standing and special committees, reports of committees on the review of bills, tabling of documents, notices of motion for first reading of bills, motions, first reading of bills, second reading of bills, consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters, Minister Statement 1-18.3, Minister Statement 19-18.3, table document 63-18.3, report of committee of the whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
Mr. Clerk, this House stands adjourned till Monday, February 12, 2018, 1:30 p.m.
Order!